Weapons is the latest film from director Zach Cregger. He, of course, is the writer and director of the very well received Barbarian back in 2022. And ever since that film, everyone has been extremely excited and curious to see what his next work would be. And when the trailer for this one dropped, I, like everyone else, was immediately intrigued. The image of a small child running into the darkness, that's some incredibly powerful and haunting horror imagery right there. That image just sort of instantly became iconic. This movie immediately shot up to the top of my most anticipated movies of the year list. So the big question is, did this film live up to the hype? I would have to say that for me, yes, I think it did. Now, when you have a horror film featuring children, there's a couple of different ways that it can go. Either the children are presented as the target of this impending threat, sort of for the purpose of introducing really high stakes to the audience, or they can become messengers or even vessels of evil. Now, because of the way the trailer and the marketing was presented, I was sort of thinking it was going to be the latter. And it brought to mind sort of films like Sinister, for instance. This film actually turned out to be something very different and probably more original and surprising in a lot of ways. So I do think I do think that some people might be disappointed that they're not getting exactly what they might be expecting. But I think that if you take this movie on its own merits, there's a lot to really appreciate here. This film is essentially a fairy tale. It opens with a child narrator explaining the premise of the film in voiceover in the first couple of minutes. The movie has innocence in peril. It has a nameless, mysterious evil. It has sort of hapless, ineffective authority figures in the form of the parents. The premise of the movie is not a spoiler, as it is set forth very clearly in just the first couple of minutes of the movie. It is set in the fictional town of Maybrook, which is presented as sort of a small, ordinary, every town. One Wednesday morning, very early in the morning, at 2:17 exactly, 17 children got out of their beds, ran out of their homes, and out into the darkness, and vanished without a trace. Now, these children all happened to come from one classroom at the local elementary school, a third grade classroom taught by a woman named Justine. Now, Justine is presented as kind of a flawed character. She definitely has her issues, but she is ultimately a caring teacher. And she's extremely upset about what has happened and the fact that so many of the parents of the missing children seem to blame her and hold her responsible for the disappearance of their children. Now, as I mentioned, 17 children disappeared. There were 18 children in Justine's classroom. And so one boy named Alex actually did show up as he was supposed to that Wednesday morning. So at the start of this film, we're presented with this incredible mystery. The movie picks up a month or two after this disappearance first happened, and there are no answers. The authorities are at a loss, and the parents left behind are understandably frustrated and looking for someone to blame. One of these angry parents is Archer, played by Josh Brolin, the father of one of the missing children named Matthew. He is the most aggressive, I guess you would say, and the most adamant in proclaiming his suspicion about the teacher in particular. And he just strongly believes that she knows something. And he begins to launch his own investigation into both her past, and the incidents surrounding his son's disappearance. Justine, for her part, in addition to struggling emotionally with this horrible event, she also launches her own investigation into what might have happened, which oddly, of course, means that both Justine and Archer are conducting their parallel investigations, and you realize as the viewer that ultimately they're going to converge. One unexpected thing about the film that I ended up really liking was the fact that the story is actually told from multiple perspectives. It's not told in a strict linear fashion. The movie is divided into chapters, each of which are devoted to the perspective of one specific character. So you see the same day or two, the same sequence of events overlapping at some points, but from different perspectives. But then, of course, you're also seeing some of the blanks get filled in, and additional context and explanation is provided for how and why certain characters end up in a certain place at a particular point in time. That I thought that that was a very effective storytelling tool. In lesser hands, this might have been confusing, but I thought that Cregger handled this very skillfully. And this storytelling device actually served to heighten tension for the viewer. You're basically given this puzzle, and you're only being given one piece at a time. And it's extremely gratifying when you get a piece that suddenly starts to bring the picture into focus. I would almost say that this feels more like a mystery slash thriller than a strict horror movie. But the only reason I'm not going to say that is because there are moments and images in this film that are straight up horror, without a doubt, including, I would say, the main antagonist. An explanation for what is going on in the town is definitely horror. So I'm not going to say that it's not a horror film, but I will say that it's a genre bending film. There's also a lot of absurdist humor that is involved in it, and it's also a character study. The characters in this film are surprisingly nuanced, and they all have flaws, but they also have qualities that humanize them and make them feel authentic, and you still sympathize with them in spite of their very obvious mistakes and the bad choices that they make. And that's unusual for a horror film. I can't think of a horror film in recent memory where I was so consistently engaged or even charmed by the characters. This movie has quite a few scenes that are actually very funny, and they're clearly intended to be funny. I believe that the director has a background in comedy, so that's not surprising. That doesn't mean it's not a horror film. It just means that it doesn't necessarily have the bleak, downbeat, consistently dour perspective that some horror movies do. The fact that it didn't, and that this movie was actually more fun, was kind of a refreshing surprise. Now, I've also heard some reviews complaining that this movie isn't, quote, about anything. Now, I admit I'm a bit puzzled by this response because horror films don't necessarily have to be thesis statements. I know that there's a lot of allegory going on in horror recently. So, how you have movies like The Babadook, or and less successfully, maybe The Woman in the Yard, where the villain is grief, or something very sort of obvious and pointed like that. So, in that sense, I guess you could say that this movie doesn't have that, but it does have, I think, some themes that it presents a bit more subtly, but are still very much there. There's definitely the theme of loss and paranoia, and the sorts of actions that grief can drive people to, and the way that it can create rifts in communities. And I'd also argue that there is some commentary on toxic family members, um, and perhaps the ways that people can feed off the emotional energy and life force of others that are under their control and take advantage of them in that way. And I think I'm actually going to choose not to present a spoiler section on this film because I really do think people should go see it. And I also think it's best that you go in to this as blind as possible. You will enjoy this movie more the less you know about it going in, because in the last act it goes pretty enjoyably bonkers. So I don't want to take that away from anybody, but I will say that the explanation is definitely surreal. It has sort of an absurdly comedic element to it, um, and it definitely puts this movie in the realm of the supernatural. So if you have a problem with supernatural horror, You're probably not going to care for the ending very much. I have no problem with it. I thought that the movie established its own internal logic. It set up the rules and then it followed them. And that's really all that I require from a movie of this genre. And I thought that the climax was ultimately highly cathartic and satisfying. When you see it, you'll know what I'm talking about. So, weapons. Um, Definitely not the movie I was expecting, but very multi layered and incredibly well executed. I think Cregger really stepped up his game after Barbarian, which I enjoyed. I liked it. I thought it was a solid movie, but um, this movie is better on pretty much every level, I would say. Ultimately, Barbarian's not a film I think about very much. It didn't make a lasting impact on me. This one, I've still been thinking about since I've seen it, and I can definitely see adding it to my annual Halloween viewing rotation. So it has a lot of rewatchability. I'd give this film a hearty. But seriously, check this one out in theaters. As a filmmaker, I think Cregger is just getting better and better, and I'm really excited to see what he does next.